Wipeout! Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. You know, 19th century English physician Havelock Ellis said, the place where optimism most flourishes is the lunatic asylum. There's no more optimistic lot than the IMF and Fed economists. Tells you all you need to know about global monetary policy. Am I not wrong, Stacy Herbert?
Yes, what do they say? The lunatics are running the asylum, and I think that's why we have the politics that we have in America and these insane elections, and now we have insane monetary policy. And the headline reads, Case for negative 2% rates, banning cash, James Grant blasts lunatic proposals. Now, many people in America, many economists, in fact, we're going to talk about two economists in particular, both are ex-IMF economists, and one of them is an ex-Fed. So, Marvin Goodfriend, a former economist and policy advisor at the Federal Reserve's Bank of Richmond, and Ken Rogoff, a chaired Harvard economics professor and a one-time chief economist at the IMF. Now, the U.S. Federal Reserve might need to cut interest rates to as low as negative 2%, far lower than levels of other global central banks have been tested. That's what would likely be needed to engineer a recovery if the U.S. economy were to fall into a recession in the next couple of years. That is according to Marvin Goodfriend, a former economist at the Fed.
During the last deflationary spiral depression, the feds, the U.S. government, confiscated people's gold. Here we are in 2016, and they're going to confiscate people's cash in an attempt to stimulate inflation by getting people to buy stuff, and particularly the stocks and bonds of the bankers and the corporations who are peddling stocks and bonds as a way to keep their Ponzi scheme going. This is almost by definition a Ponzi scheme, and it's a global Ponzi scheme, and it's wealth confiscation. It's a wealth confiscation scheme. It's dirty. It's crooked. It's not a policy as such. It's not economics as that term is understood. It's outright confiscation and at the point of a gun, essentially.
Also, Ken Rogoff, who is a former chief economist at the IMF and is now at Harvard, he has been banging the drum for banning cash because he said all sorts of evildoers use cash, including all those basket of deplorable sort of people who refuse to spend more. Perhaps it's because they don't have the income, but here he's saying that banning cash and imposing negative rates will save the economy because he says, in a deep recession, Mr. Rogoff proposes, the Fed ought not to stop cutting rates when it comes to zero. It should plunge right ahead to -1%, -2%, -3%, and so forth. At one negative rate or another, the theory goes, despoiled bank depositors will stop saving and start spending. According to the worldview of the people who constitute what Mr. Rogoff fraternally calls the policy community who elected them, the spending will buttress aggregate demand, thus restore prosperity. So what they're doing is you have this wealth and income gap emerging, right? We all know that the bottom 99.9% don't have any money anyway. And the top 0.1%, what they're doing with that cheaper and cheaper cash, with the more and more negative rates, is they're borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and buying their own shares back, which is doing nothing to boost the economy.
Look, what drives the economy is discretionary spending. People splashing out. I'll buy a new car. I'll take everyone out for dinner. But if there's no cash, you can't just whip out a couple $100 and have a party. It all goes through an electronically monitored ledger by Ken Rogoff and his friends at the Fed, who then will send you a text back and saying, you know, we understand that you're spending $200 to buy your friends drinks at Thank God It's Fridays or some other blah, blah, blah. They take all the fun out of it. There's no discretionary spending.
Yeah, but even if you have cash, so here they're saying if you give the ordinary American some cash, they might go spend it at a restaurant. Well, of course, now what you're seeing across America because of austerity is many police forces are just confiscating any cash you have. That leaves you very vulnerable. Even Canada has issued warnings to their citizens about traveling to America with any cash in their car.
Stacey, when cops in America confiscate cash, it's not cash confiscation. It's a a negative interest rate policy.
Exactly. So I want to turn to the crisis we're in America, this, a Chinese finger, what's that? Torture thing, where you can't get that thing out of there because no matter how you move, your fingers stay stuck. And the fingers...
The more you attempt to get out of it, the more entrapped you are.
Exactly. So here, Ken Rogoff is saying if we ban cash, if we impose negative rates, allegedly they'll spend more. Well, here's Dow Jones Market Watch with their opinion. The 1%ers are now destroying dollar stores. The wealthy are raising prices on lower income Americans, which is hurting bargain basement retail stores. So shares of Dollar Tree and Dollar General, the two biggest players in the dollar space market in America, their shares have fallen by 15 to 22% in August and September. And the reason? Because bad sales growth. And what they blame? Rent and healthcare, the two costs. As soon as you mentioned, there's an algorithm that looks at every single penny that every single American has extra that week, and they raise healthcare costs that much, or they raise financial services, or they raise the cost of rent that much.
Absolutely. And the things that they can't import from slave-made labor overseas, like healthcare and education, those are run by monopoly pricing that are driven by algorithms that will spy on you 24/7. And if they see an extra nickel flowing through into your bank account or in your pocket for some reason, they'll raise healthcare costs by a nickel to keep you constantly in debt. You don't want to have cash, you don't have money, you want to be in debt, you want interest rates are zero, the cost of debt is near zero, until such time as the ability to live outside of the system is eliminated, then those interest costs will go higher. Then you have what I call the revisitation of what we saw when in the genocide of the indigenous people in America. You can have a wholesale genocide of millions of Americans.
So at the top here, Ken Rogoff, the former chief economist of the IMF who imposed austerity around the world, he's saying ban cash. Do not allow any sort of sovereignty of the individual. Control them and force them to spend. Now, of course, Americans have been forced to spend on health care. So that Obamacare, as it's called, Affordable Care Act, the Affordable Health Care Act, or whatever that's called, that was supposed to bring health care affordably to all. Well, of course, all the prices keep on rising. And both the CEOs of Dollar Tree and Dollar General, in their recent conference calls to investors, the Dollar General CEO, Todd Vasquez, spends a lot of time in his stores and he looks at research to understand his customers. His conclusion, their earnings are holding up okay, but their expenses keep going up a lot. And this is hurting his business. The chief culprits, healthcare costs and rent that are rising at a very rapid clip, he told investors in the company's most recent conference call. Quote, our core consumer continues to be under a lot of pressure. As you've mentioned before, we have deflation in the cost of some computer parts and perhaps some automobiles and certainly of gasoline. Remember, we had alleged, the gasoline dividend because in America, the gasoline prices went down to something like $1.60 across America. The average price of a gallon of gasoline was $1.60. Now it's about $2. But still, that was down 50% from a year or two earlier. And everybody said, well, this is going to be like save the economy because Americans are going to have $100 billion more a year to spend. Well, apparently, healthcare costs went up by that much, as did rent.
Let's revisit the Walmart paradox, as we've discussed it on this show before. The prices at Walmart were going down faster than the reduction in wages for American workers. So net, they did not experience necessarily a reduction in the quality of their life. Because even though they lost their job or their wages were less, the price of getting a big screen TV or getting slave-made goods from China was dropping even faster. Now, that has reached the end game because the monopolists, the kleptocrats, the unregulated psychopaths, the lunatic asylum residents realized that you have a captive audience in what I call the casino gulag. That is America, where people now can't escape the fact that healthcare and other, let's say, education are rising at a very high rate of inflation. So now the loss of wages is actually, and combined, or the steady of wages, is not keeping up with the rise of these costs, these inflated costs. So now you have a genuine, real downward quality of life.
I thought you were going to say downward dog.
No, I got some new yoga pants, but I'm not talking about the downward dog, okay?
Well,
maybe I'll wear my yoga pants on the next show.
Yeah, but you know, when you go into an insane asylum, at least how they used to be, is you often see people in a white vest, wrapped.
That's called a straitjacket. It's not a vest. A vest is like, or a waistcoat is a fashion item. A straitjacket is meant for restraint. It's used in an insane asylum or a hospital or a police station.
But that's why if you have the lunatics running the asylum as we have here and as we have established in our opening, and therefore if I wrote that in the opening monologue, that means it's true. So I'm saying that they are using restraints because they themselves have lunatic ideas. These economists running the Fed, running the central bank, because they have that echo chamber. They hear voices in their head, which is themselves reflecting themselves back of their same opinion. Everybody has the same opinion. So they only see the solutions that they know in a lunatic asylum. So here you're having, they're trying to restrain the consumer with by banning cash, with negative interest rates. They're also, restraining any growth they don't seem to understand by forcing Americans to have to buy this health insurance, which is a shoddy product, by the way. It's like forcing people to buy lemons, lemon cars that don't work, which many in the subprime auto community are now doing. And Jamie Dimon, speaking of lunatic asylums, he's just said it's all contained, the subprime auto loan market.
Your comment about living in the delusion, it's like that old Woody Allen joke where he goes to the doctor and says, doctor, my brother thinks he's a chicken. And the doctor says, no problem, give him these pills. And he says, no, you don't understand, we need the eggs, right? So they live in the psychotic world of meme-driven, attention-driven economy. Like Facebook can drop 50 to 60% in a week because all the folks that are supplying all that free content can move over to a platform that pays them to give any of that content, and the valuation wouldn't be what it is now, and it'd go the way of MySpace. That could happen in a moment, and a bank like Swiss National Bank that owns shares in Facebook, now they're sitting on a huge loss based on a meme. They're eating the chicken from the imaginary brother who envisions that this is real. So obviously, at the end, you end up everyone in a straitjacket. I'd buy straitjackets. There's going to be a run on straitjackets. The price of straitjackets is going to go higher.
I think straitjacket vests. I think that's the next.
Straitjacket vests with room for your gun. Big seller in America. Well, stay tuned for the second half for even more of this insane asylum. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to James Turk of goldmoney.com. He's just returned from summer in America. So he's got his insights in what's happening in the economy in America. Let's pick his brain. James, welcome back.
Thanks, Max. Great to be with you.
All right, so you've been in America. Trump is a phenomenon there. He, Hillary Clinton referred to his voters as a basket of deplorables. Wow, are there really 30 million racist, fascist Americans, or is the economy, what's going on there?
Yeah, I really think it's the economy. It's the same thing that we saw here with regard to Brexit, that people are concerned about the way economic activity is going, and I think it's better for the UK to go alone. And it's the same thing in the United States. There's a lot of people who are unhappy with the economic conditions in the country today. I was looking recently, for example, at manufacturing employment. That's still below where it was in 2007. So a lot of this economic recovery that we supposedly have is very weak. It's temporary type jobs and not permanent type career opportunities that are being developed.
Now, here's something very interesting. I think many have talked about it, but it's becoming more of an issue. The price of stuff people need is going up. The price of stuff they don't need is going down. In other words, for TVs and clothes, stuff that's imported from the countries that are now stolen America's jobs, the prices are going down. But for stuff like healthcare and education, the actual inflation number for those items is almost skyrocketing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And don't forget about taxes. Things like property taxes are going up. So yeah, the middle class is getting pinched, and it's basically because of the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. My colleague Alistair McLeod just wrote a wonderful piece about the impoverishment of the masses by Federal Reserve policy, and that's basically what it's doing. It's destroying savings, and it's therefore destroying the middle class, and that's unfortunate because savings and the middle class are the backbone of the capitalist economy in which we live.
Right. Well, there's a huge ideological split on this point because you've got the Keynesians, you've got the Paul Krugmans of the world who say savings don't mean anything. It's just about demand. It's just about spending. It's just about borrowing. You know, savings are worthless. But let's move on to kind of this on the gold theme here on Trump. So Trump, one of his economic advisors, Dr. Judy Shelton, believes a return to a gold standard by first issuing gold convertible bonds could be a monetary solution to current problems. The partisan media has mocked her on this. Your thoughts?
Well, anything related to gold, the media is going to be pretty much against it. You know, that's mainstream thinking. But Judy Shelton's a very bright lady. She's written a couple of wonderful books and understands economic and monetary conditions very well. And I do agree with her recommendations that we need some kind of stability in monetary policy today. We don't have that. All we have are a group of people sitting around a table making decisions, thinking they know better than what millions and millions of economic participants in the economy really know, you know, down at the street level. And it's just like, you know, the Politburo in the Kremlin. You know, you can't manage an economy from a table in a Kremlin. You can't manage an economy from a table at the Federal Reserve. And ultimately, we're going to see a transition back to a new monetary policy. And hopefully we go the right way, which is away from fiat currency, debt currency, and into gold and silver, which is, of course, constitutional money.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, I think, don't realize that in an economy like America that lauds itself as being a market economy with supply and demand ruling the roost, the price of money itself is not set by the market.
Yeah, you can't do that, and you can't have negative interest rates. I mean, it's a folly. You know, 100 years from now, people are going to look back at this era and say, you know, how could people have been so crazy to buy government bonds and get less money back in 10 years? You know, that's absurd. That's not the way capitalism works. You're not being compensated for your risk. You're not being compensated for in making investments. And so as a result, there's going to be a transition. And whether it's going to be a result of a surprise election or some other events, we don't know, but we have to be prepared for it. One of the best ways to be prepared, of course, is to own physical gold and physical silver.
Now, you know, these negative rates have contributed to rising stock prices and property prices and bond prices, but they haven't outlawed human nature, and it hasn't outlawed the cycle of markets, and so we're now primed for another correction or a crash, or it comes every 7 years or so. But there's no tools in the toolbox. There's no way to deal with the crisis because you're at zero or negative. And, you know, the European Central Bank, I read last week, they were underwriting the financing of a donut chain. You know, I mean, you can't just buy everything. You just can't buy. So how's that going to work, James?
Yeah, you know, there are a couple of interesting points there. First of all, as they buy more and more corporate debt, as they buy more ETFs and even shares of corporations, things are becoming nationalized, and that's not good. That's the destruction of private property. That's the destruction of private economy. But, you know, more importantly, you have to recognize that wealth comes in two forms. It comes in tangible wealth, and then it comes in financial wealth. And financial wealth is based on promises. You have counterparty risk. You know, will the person who's supposed to owe you money really make good at the end of the day? And one of the things I learned as a young boy, growing up in the late 40s and 50s from my parents who went through the Great Depression, is that after you have the financial bust, the real wealth is still there. The land is still there, the factories are still there, the houses are still there, et cetera. And the gold and silver, of course, are still there. And I think what we're going to go through in the foreseeable future here is that there will be another bust like the Great Depression, like 2008, but much, much worse, where a lot of debts are going to be reneged upon. A lot of promises are going to be broken. So I think the general theme still is to move out of financial assets where you have counterparty risk and move into real assets of all different sorts.
Now, there is a wild card out there. We've seen radical monetary policy on the part of the central banks with negative interest rates. There's another radical solution waiting in the wings that seems to be gaining currency. This idea that we can, in this global economy, roll up all these bad debts sitting on the central bank's balance sheets into a credit facility financed by the IMF and special drawing rights. In other words, they can create a $100 trillion credit facility, all the bad debts on the ECB, Federal Reserve Bank, Bank of Japan, Bank of England, swap for SDRs, and the game can continue. James Turk, your thoughts?
Well, the game has continued much longer than I expected, to be quite honest. They always seem to be pulling some kind of rabbit out of the hat to keep the debt bubble, you know, building and going. But eventually you reach the end of the line. There are just too many debts out there to be serviced. And that's one of the reasons why interest rates are so low. Governments cannot afford to pay a fair rate of interest simply because they have so much debt. For example, in the United States, you have $20 trillion worth of debt now. If the interest rates were to raise 1%, that's $200 billion to the annual budget expenses, paying interest on the debt. If you went to a fair interest rate of, say, 5%, that's $1 trillion. Well, the government only gets $3.2 trillion a year in revenue. Where are they going to cut, spending to pay the extra trillion in interest expense? They're not going to do it, and that's ultimately leads to the destruction of the currency.
Let's talk about rich people. Rich people have tens of trillions of maybe not. I don't think it's 100 trillion. You would know better. But the amount of money that's in investable assets for the wealthy around the world, it's a lot.
Yeah, total wealth is about 100 trillion. They say.
About 100 trillion is sitting there. The wealthy people, they've got the 100 trillion, and less than 1%. And again, you would know this better, but I think around 1% or less is invested in gold and silver.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so let's say I'm a rich person. Let's say I've got 100 million, I've got $500 million, I've got $1 billion, and I'm being told that, well, we're going to bail out the global economy by turning the IMF into a super global national bank. Christine Lagarde's going to be Janet Yellen on steroids, and Ben Bernanke and Bank of Japan. We're going to create a $100 trillion credit facility, and we're going to roll everything up. Now, would you, A, decide to be like, well, that sounds reasonable, I'm just going to roll everything into an SDR? Or B, would you be like, you know what, I'm going to buy some gold? And if the rich folks out there with $100 trillion, and the whole gold market itself was like $6 trillion, so you've got $100 trillion trying to go through a $6 trillion hole. So what happens to that hole? What happens to the price? I mean, what do you see happening potentially?
Yeah, well, I think the price of gold and silver are going to go much, much higher. But there's an important point that you're actually bringing up. I think the rich really...
You say that like it would be a mistake. Like I'm actually bringing it up. Of course I'm bringing up a good point, James. I mean, that's the point of the show, to bring up good points. I've been doing it for 1,000 episodes.
Let's say a different point rather than a good point, in the sense that it's not just gold and silver going to benefit. I think the rich already understand that currencies are being destroyed. That's why if you look at property here in London, prices are really sky high, and the rich people are basically exiting the currency and moving into anything they can get their hands on. That's why they're paying tens of millions for a Monet or for an Andy Warhol. Anything collectible, anything real, anything tangible. That's where the big money is actually moving into.
So
we're
already seeing this migration to stuff.
Yes.
We're already seeing it. It's just not hitting gold and silver. Why?
Well, you have the price suppression from central banks to try to keep gold and silver under control, because gold and silver are a warning
signal. Is that a
signal.
conspiracy theory? I mean, in an age where Hillary's health was a conspiracy theory, then she's stumbling to the car. And we hear that 9/11 was a conspiracy theory, then there's 28 pages released that the Saudis did it. Gold and silver price suppression was a conspiracy theory, but now we've got ample proof around the world that, in fact, they are suppressing the price of gold in the markets using naked short selling, everything we've been talking about for years. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the mainstream media might call it a conspiracy theory, but factually, you can actually analyze all of the work that's been done by, for example, a Gold Antitrust Action Committee, GATA.org. All that stuff's available for free on their website, and they've got over 15 years of data showing that it's not a conspiracy; it's actual fact.
Well,
it's monetary
I think
policy.
Deutsche Bank just admitted recently. Yes. They got the smoking gun.
Yes, exactly. And you've seen other instances as well.
We're troublemakers, James. I got to step in here for a second, because remember a few years ago, we were talking about the fact that Germany doesn't have their gold. It's held in New York, and GATA started carrying the story. And now, everyone in Germany had no idea that they don't actually have the gold in Germany. And it started this German request to repatriate gold from New York, and they said, we'll do it in 6 or 7 years.
Yeah.
Okay, how's that going? I mean, Amsterdam's repatriating, they're all repatriating, and the U.S. is saying, well, we'll take our time doing it. Should these countries be worried that they'll never see their gold?
Yeah, I think so. And, there's no reason anymore to have gold stored in other countries around the world, because gold isn't used, as it was under the gold standard, to settle balance of payments differences. So what you really want to do is you want to have that gold safe and secure. So every country should have the gold stored back in their own country.
Is that part of the Russophobia out there? In other words, the U.S. is living in the 1950s, and they're claiming that the Cold War is on. And even though NATO is like building military bases on Russia's frontier, and U.S. jets are invading, Russian airspace, they're claiming, or threatening to push against Russian airspace in the Black Sea area. They claim that there's this existential threat, which was the basis for why a lot of countries moved their gold back during World War II, because of the Russian threat that Russia was still there in Europe. So Germany and France, these countries moved it out. They moved it to the U.S. So. But is that one of the reasons why we hear so much anti-Russian talk, is because the U.S. can say, oh, Russia's going to steal your gold, when in fact America is the biggest threat to stealing your gold. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it was America that confiscated gold back in the 1930s. But then
exactly!
But then again, so did Stalin, Mussolini, and Hitler. They all confiscated gold. So, who knows what's going to come in the future. But I always go back to what President Eisenhower said in his final State of the Union address when he left as president, that you have to be aware and concerned about and be alert to the military-industrial complex. And I would add it today to the military-industrial financial complex, because it's all one and the same.
All right, we got to leave it there. Military-industrial financial complex.
Correct. Be
warned. James Turk, thanks so much.
Thanks, Max.
That's going to do it for this episode of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, James Turk of GoldMoney.com. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Bye, y'all.